May 26, 1941. The North Atlantic, 1830 hours. The wind hammered the flight deck of HMS Ark Royal. Spray crashed over the carrier's edge, tasting of salt and impending disaster. Below the churning clouds, the ocean was a gray, violent mess. This was the hunting ground of the largest, most formidable warship afloat, the German battleship Bismarck. A handful of obsolete biplanes shuddered on the deck. They were Fairey Swordfish, canvas wings, fixed landing gear, a maximum speed slower than many road cars. The Royal Navy had thrown everything at Bismarck for 3 days. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all had failed or been shaken off. Now it came down to this. Lieutenant Commander John Moffat strapped himself into the open cockpit. The smell of oil, canvas, and fear filled the small space. His target was a behemoth that could withstand any direct shell fire, a vessel whose main guns fired shells heavier than his entire plane. The sun was falling fast. If they failed to cripple the Bismarck before dark, the German warship would slip into French waters and safety, guaranteeing the strangulation of Britain's Atlantic lifeline. This antique biplane, mocked by many, was the last throw of the dice. Its crew knew this was a suicide run, yet the launch flares arced into the darkening sky, signaling the start of the final, desperate assault. The sheer scale of the Atlantic War required such gambles. The global conflict hinged on logistics. Britain was an island fortress, utterly dependent on the sea lanes for survival. Every calorie, every round of ammunition, every barrel of oil had to cross the unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic. This was the tonnage war. Britain needed to import over 1 million tons of supplies each week simply to keep fighting. To Germany, the ocean was the critical front. Starve the island, and the war would end. From 1939 to 1941, the German strategy unfolded in 2 brutal phases. The first was the relentless U-boat campaign. Submarines operating in wolf packs tore gaps in the slow, vulnerable Allied convoys. The losses were astronomical. But for Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, a second, even more terrifying weapon was needed: the surface raider. These were warships designed not to fight fleets, but to shatter supply lines. Fast, heavily armed, and difficult to track, ships like the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had already proven their ability to disrupt the Atlantic flow and tie up massive Royal Navy assets in hunts. The pinnacle of this predatory design was the battleship Bismarck. She was not just a ship, she was a declaration. Commissioned in August 1940, Bismarck represented the absolute peak of German naval engineering. She was a steel colossus, 50,000 tons fully loaded, capable of slicing through the waves at over 30 knots. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, a concrete bunker wrapped in steel. Her primary armament consisted of 8 15-inch guns, each capable of hurling a 1,770-pound shell over 20 miles. No single warship in the Royal Navy, save for the aging battlecruiser Hood, could match her combination of speed, armor, and firepower. Her mission, dubbed Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, was simple and catastrophic for the Allies. Accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, Bismarck was to break out from the Baltic, bypass the North Atlantic choke points, and vanish into the vast ocean. Once there, she would hunt convoys. A single appearance by this Leviathan could scatter a 20-ship convoy, sinking merchant vessels at will, and forcing the convoy escorts, destroyers and light cruisers into suicide attacks. The threat was not just physical, it was psychological. The existence of an unsinkable raider operating freely in the Atlantic would force the British Admiralty to divert battleships and aircraft carriers, the core of the home fleet, to guard every major convoy route. This would drain resources from the Mediterranean and the Pacific, guaranteeing the success of the U-boat packs left behind. Bismarck was a fleet in being, reduced to a single ship. On May 18, 1941, the German force slipped out of the Gortenhafen. The stakes for Britain were impossibly high. Failure to stop Bismarck meant the collapse of the Atlantic supply line, and likely, the end of the war for the British Empire. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin, mobilized every available unit for the pursuit. This unprecedented concentration of force began almost immediately after a Swedish cruiser first sighted the German fleet moving north. The hunt was on, leading inevitably to the clash that would define the opening days of Operation Rheinübung. The escape was swift, but not unseen. A handful of Norwegian resistance spotters confirmed the passage of the German force near Bergen. The Admiralty moved immediately. Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, committed every available capital ship to the interception. This was not a hunt. It was a desperate mobilization. HMS Prince of Wales, a brand new but still untested King George V class battleship, sailed with the aging but beloved battlecruiser HMS Hood. They were the fastest heavy ships available, tasked with patrolling the critical gap between Iceland and Greenland, the Denmark Strait. The weather was brutal. Fog, sleet, and freezing seas characterized the vast, empty zone. The cruiser squadron, led by Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, finally made contact. On the night of May 23, 1941, the German shadows were picked up by radar. Bismarck and Prince Eugen were slicing south, right on course. Holland prepared for a dawn engagement. May 24, 1941, 05:52 hours. The ships emerged from the cold mist. Holland, aboard the Hood, signalled the order to engage. The German ships were only 13 miles away. The ensuing battle of the Denmark Strait lasted a mere 7 minutes, yet it reshaped naval warfare and scarred the British psyche. Hood opened fire first, targeting Prinz Eugen by mistake, momentarily confusing the targets. Bismarck's gunnery was devastatingly accurate. At 05:55, German shells began straddling the British ships. At 0600, the 5th German salvo, fired at maximum elevation and plunging steeply, found the Hood. 1 or possibly 2 shells penetrated the thin deck armor into the aft ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. A pillar of flame hundreds of feet high erupted from the midship section. The 48,000-ton battlecruiser, pride of the Royal Navy and symbol of British sea power, broke in two and sank in under 3 minutes. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. The shock was total. The loss of the Hood was a devastating psychological and military blow, forcing the young Prince of Wales to turn away, suffering 7 hits and damage to her fire control systems. The victory belonged utterly to the Germans. However, during the chaos, the British managed a crucial strike. Shells from Prince of Wales scored 2 hits on Bismarck. 1 shell impacted below the waterline, puncturing a fuel tank and contaminating fuel reserves. More critically, it caused a major oil leak. Captain Ernst Lindemann was forced to reduce speed to conserve his remaining fuel, and the ship left a telltale oily slick on the waves. Bismarck, though victorious, was wounded. Admiral Tovey now had a singular driving imperative: vengeance and survival. The hunter was also the hunted. Bismarck needed to reach the repair facilities at Brest, France to survive. Tovey ordered every ship, from the battleships King George V and Rodney to cruisers and destroyers, into a relentless dragnet across the Atlantic. The sea was vast, but Bismarck's oil trail and reduced speed meant the window of opportunity was closing fast for the Germans. The massive steel Leviathan now raced toward the French coast, shadowed by a handful of British ships, knowing that the entire weight of the Royal Navy was converging for a final, desperate confrontation. The relentless pursuit began, transforming the North Atlantic into a colossal, strategic race against time. The chase across the Atlantic was not merely a physical contest of speed and firepower. It was a collision between opposing visions of naval warfare. The core of this conflict lay in the staggering technological paradox surrounding the Bismarck. On one side stood the Fairey Swordfish, a relic of a bygone era. Designed in the early 1930s, it was an anachronism by 1941, known affectionately as the Stringbag because it appeared to hold its shape with string. The aircraft was constructed from fabric stretched over a metal frame. It had an open cockpit, fixed landing gear, and a top speed of barely 140 miles per hour, making it one of the slowest planes in service. Its offensive weapon was a single 1,600-pound torpedo. Against the Bismarck, this machine was seemingly useless. The Bismarck, conversely, was the zenith of armoured engineering. Its command tower was protected by titanium-hardened steel plates. Its propulsion system was a marvel, driving the massive hull at high speed. The German engineers had studied the Hood's weaknesses and designed Bismarck with layered internal compartmentation, intended to make it impervious to torpedo strikes. Her anti-aircraft defense was a dense, interlocking wall of multiple calibers, from the heavy 105mm guns down to rapid-fire 20mm cannons. To fly a slow, fabric biplane against that barrage was madness. The paradox was this: the antique technology, precisely because of its slow speed and high maneuverability, presented a target that sophisticated, high-speed German rangefinders and fire control systems struggled to track. They were aiming for a sleek fighter. They were hitting an aerial bicycle. The sinking of Hood had not only claimed a ship and 1,415 lives, it had shattered the prestige of the Royal Navy. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the pursuit from the battleship HMS King George V, carried the weight of national expectation. Tovey was a brilliant strategist, but faced immense operational pressure. His immediate priority was not revenge, but the preservation of the Atlantic lifeline. He knew the German escape plan was strategically sound. If Bismarck reached the protective air cover of the Luftwaffe bases in France, it might never be caught. Tovey's leadership was characterised by relentless determination and careful calculation. He pushed his own fleet to the limits of endurance, facing dangerously low fuel levels in his own flagship and accompanying destroyers. He had to coordinate disparate forces scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The main battle group, Force H, racing up from Gibraltar and shadowing cruiser forces. His key decision was maintaining the pursuit despite the risks, relying on the cruisers to keep visual contact while he maneuvered his heavy assets into position for the kill. He refused to give up the chase, knowing that the smallest window of opportunity was all they needed. Aboard the Bismarck, Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann managed the brief German triumph and the subsequent retreat. Lindemann was the model of a disciplined, professional naval officer. Following the destruction of the Hood, his immediate focus shifted from raiding to survival. He had proven his ship's fighting capacity, but the oil leak caused by the Prince of Wales hits compromised his ability to escape. The speed reduction and the necessity to shed the accompanying Prinz Eugen to confuse the British showed Lindemann's ruthless adherence to the mission's ultimate goal, reaching Brest. However, the constant presence of British shadowers cruisers like HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk meant the crew was under constant tension. Lindemann's stoicism was necessary to maintain morale aboard the wounded giant. He knew the British would commit everything, and every hour gained was a victory. The atmosphere below the armoured decks was a mix of triumph and fatalistic awareness. The ship was invincible in a gunfight, but its fundamental vulnerability was exposed. It needed fuel and refuge. Lindemann's orders were curt, precise, and dictated by the narrow strategic window closing rapidly ahead. His primary strategic concern was the weather. Bad visibility would aid evasion. Clear skies would invite the dreaded air attack. The hunt stretched into its third day, covering thousands of miles of water. The strategic concerns of both leaders were now intensely focused on a single moment: the detection of the evasive maneuver that could lose the German battleship for good. Following the Denmark Strait, Captain Lindemann successfully executed a brilliant maneuver to shake off his immediate shadows. On the night of May 24, Bismarck had two British heavy cruisers, HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk, locked onto her position using newly developed radar. The German ship was steering southeast, apparently heading for the protection of Brest. However, under the cover of a brief exchange of fire with the shadowing cruisers, Lindemann ordered a sharp 270-degree turn to the west. This brief, high-speed feint broke the radar contact. The British cruisers, relying heavily on their electronic tracking, continued to steam southeast for several critical hours, believing Bismarck was still ahead of them. This maneuver provided Bismarck with a priceless window of freedom. For over 30 hours, the German battleship was utterly lost in the vastness of the Atlantic. The Admiralty in London was thrown into chaos. All momentum was lost. The pursuing British battleships, running dangerously low on fuel, were forced to alter course based on conjecture and fear. It was the strategic equivalent of a ship vanishing into thin air. Lindemann had outwitted the most advanced elements of the British fleet. He maintained this state of high tension and high speed, knowing that every mile covered brought him closer to the safety of the Luftwaffe air umbrella. The fate of the entire operation hinged on the actions of one auxiliary group, Force H, steaming north from Gibraltar. This force was centered around the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, the battlecruiser HMS Renown, and the cruiser HMS Sheffield. Crucially, Ark Royal carried a large complement of Fairey Swordfish. They were the key to the entire operation. While Tovey's battleships, King George V and Rodney, were the necessary instruments of destruction, they were running out of time and fuel. Ark Royal represented the only means of extending the effective range of the British fleet beyond the visual and radar horizon. Force H's race north was a grueling, high-speed dash across hundreds of miles of ocean. Their arrival on the scene was the last strategic card Britain could play. If Bismarck slipped past them, there was nothing left to prevent her from reaching France. The reliance on the Ark Royal's aircraft illustrated a fundamental shift in naval power, even if the weapons they carried were obsolete. The carrier, once a supporting vessel, was now the ultimate game-changer, acting as a mobile airfield capable of delivering a knockout blow hundreds of miles away. The men of the Fleet Air Arm, piloting the Swordfish, fought a different war entirely. They were not sheltered behind 16 inches of armour plate. Their cockpits were open to the freezing North Atlantic air. They flew low and slow, facing nausea-inducing turbulence just above the mountainous waves. Their job was precision delivery, dropping a single, heavy torpedo into the water at exactly the right height and speed to ensure it armed and ran true, without breaking up upon impact. These crews, a pilot, an observer, and a wireless operator gunner, were young men asked to attack the most heavily armed ship in the world with the naval equivalent of a paper aeroplane. Their courage was not the stoic, measured bravery of men in a battleship turret. It was the raw, exposed bravery of a three-man crew, fully aware that the moment they broke through the low clouds, they would be entering a firestorm of flak. Their mission was not to sink the ship, but to cripple it. They were to disable the behemoth so the main fleet could catch it. They were the tactical hinge upon which the entire chase would turn. The search grid was immense and the weather unforgiving. The crucial break came late on May 26th. A Royal Air Force Coastal Command Catalina flying boat, piloted by an American, Ensign Leonard B. Smith, spotted the dark smudge of the Bismarck nearly 700 miles west of Brest. The ship was still steering east, confirming the target. The weather was worsening, but the position was precisely where Force H could make the intercept. The Swordfish was scrambled for the final, desperate strike. The decisive moment was now measured in hours, not days. May 26, 1941. The vastness of the Atlantic was suddenly compressing. The sighting by the Catalina at 10:30 a.m. placed Bismarck 700 miles from Brest, precisely in the path of Force H. Admiral Tovey's main battle group, fueled by desperation, was still days behind. The job of stopping the warship fell entirely to HMS Ark Royal and the cruisers of Force H. The weather was the enemy's ally. Squalls and low, oppressive cloud cover provided Lindemann the visual protection he craved. The sea state worsened, with waves beginning to crest at over 30 feet, making flight operations perilous. At 2:50 p.m., HMS Ark Royal launched a strike force of 15 Swordfish. Their mission was to locate, track, and, if possible, cripple the target. The conditions for the air crews were brutal. The small biplanes were tossed violently by the wind, forcing pilots into continuous, exhausting correction. Visibility was near zero in the squalls. As the Swordfish penetrated the search zone, confusion reigned. The force mistakenly sighted a lone British warship through a rain curtain. Believing they had found Bismarck, the pilots pressed the attack. The target was the light cruiser HMS Sheffield, which was shadowing the German battleship. The pilots dropped their torpedoes. Sheffield miraculously avoided all 11 torpedoes aimed at her, maneuvering frantically. Several of the torpedoes were faulty, exploding prematurely in the churning sea, a damning failure that indicated the unreliability of the weapon system. The attack was a humiliating and dangerous blunder. The Swordfish were recalled, their crews chastened and shaken. Admiral Tovey, upon hearing the report, faced the chilling reality. They were running out of time, daylight, and reliable weapons. The failure was quickly followed by a grim strategic assessment. If the next attack failed, or if the weather worsened completely, Bismarck would reach the protective zone of German U-boats and land-based aircraft. The fate of the battle was now tied to the few hours remaining before dusk. The air crews knew the gravity of their position. They rearmed, refueling in the massive swell of the Ark Royal, knowing the next flight would be the last chance. At 7 p.m., a second, smaller strike force of 15 Swordfish was launched. The crews were briefed again, this time with absolute clarity on their target identification. Lieutenant Commander John Moffat led the attack. The storm was now at its worst, providing a cover that was both a shield and a curse. They flew low, barely above the wave peaks, using the clouds as cover from the German radar. The rhythm of the biplane engines was a slow, deliberate thrumming against the roar of the wind. The final confrontation was only minutes away. The tension aboard Bismarck was palpable. German sailors knew they were close to safety. They tracked the storm fronts, trusting in the weather and their heavy armor. But they had not anticipated the desperate persistence of the biplanes. Suddenly, radar operators screamed a warning, low-flying aircraft emerging from the cloud ceiling directly to starboard. The time for evasion had run out. May 26, 1941, 7:10 p.m. The final Swordfish attack pressed home through the darkening, storm-whipped skies. Lieutenant Commander John Moffat, piloting his biplane with the observer Sub-Lieutenant J.D.V.K. Slattery and the telegraphist air gunner Ned Darlow, found the target. Bismarck was a magnificent sight, a dark, sleek monster cutting through the immense waves, her camouflage paint barely visible in the gloom. The moment the biplanes broke clear of the rain clouds, the German ship's anti-aircraft defences erupted. The air around the Swordfish instantly filled with tracers and high-explosive shrapnel. The 105mm guns were useless against the slow, low-flying aircraft, but the lighter 37mm and 20mm cannons laid down a terrifying, dense screen of fire. The Swordfish formation broke apart, diving individually toward the target to present a scattered profile. They flew so low that the spray from the waves occasionally dashed against their wings. Moffat headed directly for the Bismarck's port side. His plane was buffeted by the concussive force of the flak, the fabric wings shuddering under near hits. The German gunners were firing with frenzied intensity, but their fire control was ineffective against the slow-moving, low-flying Stringbags. The biplane's design, initially a liability, became its shield. At just under 1,000 yards, Moffat leveled his aircraft. The roar of his own engine was swallowed by the explosions. He could clearly see the German faces in the superstructure. He sighted his target, the midship section, and released the torpedo. He pulled up hard, narrowly missing the ship's massive secondary gun turrets, and dove back into the relative safety of the clouds. The torpedo ran true. Other Swordfish scored minor non-fatal hits on the main belt armor, but Moffat's torpedo, dropped at the perfect altitude and speed, struck the German battleship at the stern, exactly where the powerful engines delivered their thrust. The massive shockwave resonated through the hull. The damage was initially assessed as minor water ingress. Then came the devastating realization. The torpedo had detonated against the highly specialized rudder assembly. The two massive rudders were either jammed hard over to port or destroyed entirely. Captain Lindemann ordered immediate counter-steering maneuvers with the screws, one propeller forward, the other reverse, the standard procedure for naval steering in an emergency. It was useless. The sheer power of the waves and the immense weight of the ship overwhelmed the counterthrust. Bismarck, the most feared battleship in the world, was crippled. At 7:45 p.m., the ship reported to Group West that she was completely unable to steer. The German giant began an agonizing, uncontrollable circle in the immense waves. She was no longer a mighty raider racing towards safety. She was a massive, steerable target, drifting aimlessly at the mercy of the pursuing British fleet. Lindemann knew his fate was sealed. The news reached Admiral Tovey late that evening. The sheer relief was palpable. The outdated biplane had achieved what the might of the home fleet could not. It had delivered the single, disabling blow. The age of the all-big-gun battleship was drawing to a close, defeated by a piece of technology that seemed straight out of World War I. The British destroyers, running on fumes, were now ordered to converge on the wallowing target for night-long harassment, ensuring the Bismarck would be held fast until Tovey's battleships arrived at dawn to deliver the coup de grace. The once invincible Bismarck lay broken, awaiting the rising sun and the inevitable punishment it would bring. The night of May 26th into the 27th was a psychological torment for the crew of the crippled Bismarck. The giant ship could only motor slowly in circles, effectively stalled in the open Atlantic. The Royal Navy delivered the first taste of retribution. A screen of 5 destroyers led by Captain Philip Vian, later famous for the convoy battles, closed in. They launched sporadic torpedo attacks throughout the stormy night. The primary goal of the destroyers was not to sink the Bismarck. Their torpedoes were insufficient against her armor, but to ensure she remained immobile and exhausted her crew. The German sailors endured constant alarms, the bone-jarring impact of the high seas, and the sheer terror of unseen torpedoes. They fought off the persistent destroyers with their secondary armament, but the constant action prevented any effective damage control or repair efforts on the rudder. The night became a brutal, wearing ordeal, extinguishing any hope of a miracle escape. At dawn on May 27th, the battleships HMS King George V, Admiral Tovey's flagship, and HMS Rodney arrived, fresh and ready for the kill. They were joined by the heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire. The final surface engagement began at 8:47 a.m. The British ships approached from the west, placing Bismarck between themselves and the morning sun. Rodney opened fire first. The initial exchange of salvos demonstrated the power of the 16-inch guns of Rodney and the 14-inch guns of King George V. Bismarck returned fire, but her ability to aim was severely compromised by the lack of steering. By 9:30 a.m., British shells began landing consistently. Within an hour, the Bismarck's 2 forward turrets were disabled. The massive superstructure was battered, ripped open by high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. The battle was a relentless, close-range execution. The British battleships circled, firing until their guns glowed red. The German ship was silenced by 10 a.m., her main armament destroyed, her bridge flattened, and her fire control shattered. She was a burning, listing hulk, still afloat, but no longer capable of resistance. Captain Lindemann, realizing the situation was hopeless, likely gave the order to scuttle the ship to prevent its capture. The final blows were delivered by torpedoes from HMS Dorsetshire, which struck the already burning hull. At 10:40 a.m., the Bismarck rolled over and sank, stern first, to the bottom of the deep Atlantic. The cost was devastating. Of the estimated 2,200 crew aboard the Bismarck, only 114 survived. The cold North Atlantic waters claimed the lives of over 2,100 German sailors, including Captain Lindemann. Admiral Tovey, observing the scene, was reportedly moved by the courage of the men he had destroyed, later stating, "The Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy." The hunt was over, the threat eradicated, but the human cost was immense. The sinking of the Bismarck was more than the end of a single ship. It was a profound inflection point in naval doctrine. The immediate operational result was immense. The German surface threat to the Atlantic convoys was crippled. Although her sister ship, the Tirpitz, remained operational and tied up significant British naval resources as a fleet in being in Norwegian fjords, no other German capital ship ever again posed such a devastating, independent threat to Allied shipping. The supply lines were secured, ensuring that American materiel could flow freely to Britain, a strategic victory that cannot be overstated. The engagement cemented a critical technological lesson. Air power reigned supreme. It was not the massive 16-inch guns of the battleships that delivered the decisive blow, but the 1,600-pound torpedo dropped by a slow, obsolete biplane. The Swordfish, an aircraft mocked for its antiquity, had proven the absolute vulnerability of even the most heavily armoured battleship to a crippling aerial strike below the waterline. This outcome confirmed the long-held beliefs of naval air enthusiasts and accelerated the strategic shift toward the aircraft carrier as the indispensable capital ship of the future. The era of the battleship as the unchallenged master of the sea was fundamentally over. For the German Navy, the loss was crushing. Admiral Raeder's ambition for a dominant surface fleet was severely curtailed. The failure of Operation Rheinübung forced Hitler to focus almost exclusively on the U-boat campaign, recognizing that the sheer cost of building and operating capital ships was unjustifiable if a single well-placed torpedo could neutralize them. The remaining large German ships were largely relegated to harbour defence or restricted raiding in the Arctic, never again challenging the Royal Navy in open battle. For the British, the victory provided a massive morale boost at a critical time. Britain was standing alone against the Axis powers. The psychological impact of the Hood's loss was negated by the swift, comprehensive destruction of her killer. Winston Churchill's relief was immense, solidifying public confidence in the Admiralty's ability to defend the nation's vital lifelines. Furthermore, the pursuit highlighted the crucial role of combined forces and intelligence. The coordinated efforts of the RAF Coastal Command, Catalina, the Royal Navy, battleships and destroyers, and the Fleet Air Arm, Swordfish, demonstrated a level of operational cohesion that was increasingly necessary in modern warfare. The development of radar technology, though imperfect in the initial chase, was also proven indispensable in tracking and locating targets across the immense ocean. The technological arms race, already fierce, intensified, driven by the realization that crippling speed and maneuverability, delivered from the air, was the key to naval dominance. The legacy of the Bismarck became a stark warning. Size and armour were no longer guarantees of invulnerability in the face of focused air attack. The hunt for the Bismarck remains one of the most concentrated and decisive operations of World War II. But its final lesson is not about the strength of steel. It is about the power of adaptability and courage. The event, spanning mere days, became a classic David versus Goliath narrative. The Goliath was the German supership, 50,000 tons of sophisticated engineering designed to withstand the heaviest shell fire and dominate the seas. The David was the antiquated Fairey Swordfish, a biplane of fabric and wood, dismissed as a museum piece. Its victory revealed a truth that transcends naval warfare. Technological superiority is meaningless without tactical application. The Germans focused on maximizing armor against horizontal trajectory guns. They did not adequately prepare for a slow, low-altitude attack from a primitive weapon aimed at the ship's most vulnerable point, the submerged control surfaces. The courage of the Fleet Air Arm pilots, flying manually into a storm of flak, underscores the ultimate factor in war, the human element. Lieutenant Commander Moffat and his crew did not fear the 15-inch guns. They feared the 20mm rapid-fire cannons at close range. Their success was a triumph of nerve, precision, and the willingness to execute a seemingly impossible task. Their story demonstrates that innovation in warfare is often less about the costliest hardware and more about finding the Achilles heel of an opponent's design. The Bismarck was a vessel that embodied national pride and technological hubris. Its brief, terrifying life and sudden, brutal death served as a powerful metaphor. The ocean does not care for armor thickness or gun caliber. In the end, the ultimate lesson of the hunt for the Bismarck is that the seemingly obsolete can still deliver the decisive blow, forever changing the nature of conflict and sealing the fate of the battleship as the primary arbiter of sea power. The sea claimed the monster, proving that in war, a single, perfectly executed maneuver can overcome years of superior design.